Thank you to the organizers of this. I'm Dave Thompson. I'm from Massachusetts, birthplace of Scheme and free software. Must be something in the water because I'm into those things too. I am the CTO at Spritely Institute. That's a relatively recent development. What has been going on longer is that I've been a Guile and Guix user and contributor for over 10 years. And I'd like to tell you a little story about how I got to where I am, how I discovered Guix, and Guile, how I use it, and how we use it at Spritely. Um, so let me spin you a yarn, if I may. Beaver Plant 2012, creator of Ruby gave a talk, How Emacs Changed My Life. And I also met for the first time Christine Lemmer-Weber, who at the time was maintaining GNU Media Goblin, a decentralized media hosting platform. These will all become very relevant in short order. So as a result of attending that conference, I immediately dropped Vim and started learning Emacs. And I also started to use and start to tinker with GNU Media Goblin. And shortly thereafter, by some coincidence, I was looking for my first programming job, and I got hired to write Ruby just after months before meeting the creator and being moved by this talk about Emacs. And this is also relevant to Guix eventually. At the same time, I was getting into professional software development, but I also really wanted to make video games as a hobby. And I went a pretty common route where people use like C or C++ and then embed a scripting language into it. And so I started with Lua, as is a very common choice. But then I found this little book called Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. Perhaps you've heard of it. It was a huge influence on me. And as soon as I started reading that, I was like, OK, forget Lua. I got to learn Scheme. I have to look for a scheme to use. Oh, Scheme is not any one specific implementation. It's this thing, and there's a lot of implementations around. I'm so confused. What do I do? What scheme do I use? Well, I found Guile. And given that I was just attending FSF's LibrePlanet and I was all into the GNU project, I noticed that Guile was the official GNU extension language. So I thought, why don't I go with that? You can embed the interpreter into your C program and extend C programs with scripting and Scheme. That's great. But at what cost? I'll get back to this, but extending C programs is not really how we want to do things anymore, at least. But it is how I got into this whole thing. Moving on, and part of this talk is that I hope some of this feels relatable to people, because I'm very flattered to be asked to talk here, and as someone that people want to maybe listen to about what I have to say. But not that long ago, I was just, I wanted to participate in free software, but I had no idea how to do it. And so for a long time, like I just struggled to find, how do I be part of this community? How do I participate? And the project that helped me out the most was actually the GNU Media Goblin project. And I had just met Christine, at LibrePlanet 2012. And so that project turned out to be very, very welcoming. And it had an issue tracker that had a bite-sized tag. And it was for labeling issues that a newcomer could do without too much work and too much effort for someone to review their first patches. And so I added a very simple thing. It was an option to enable or disable comments on a Media Goblin instance. And it turns out that was really enough to have that initial success and gratification of contributing to something to use as a springboard onto other things. So later that year, I heard about Guix because I was getting into Guile, and Guix was this new thing that Guile maintainer Ludovic Cortez started making. And I hadn't heard of Nix, but Guix sure looked fascinating. I was doing a lot of system administration at the time, and I was just getting, as many of us have been, frustrated by the problems with imperative package management, managing our traditional, quote unquote, traditional distributions like Debian-based distributions, and, losing a day's work because you did a dist upgrade before something important when you really shouldn't, the usual things that bring us all here. And I started using Guix before there was even a distro to run. That hadn't quite been bootstrapped yet. But as soon as it did, I switched over from Debian to Guix. I don't know exactly how long, but it was not very long after that the distro was bootable that I ran it. So sometimes I have a problem like I've been using it so long and I've dealt with so many problems that like the installer, even though like the Guix installer isn't that, could be improved a lot, it's still so much better than what there was. So I'm just so thankful for some of those things. And I'm often not the best person to suggest like UX improvements because I was there during the early days when everything was really clunky. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but why Guix? This should probably ring true to a lot of people here. That the functional package management model, like reproducibility, rollback, all of those nice things. Different users can install different software, and they don't clash. The practical software freedom aspect of it, distros felt a little difficult to get into. I didn't know how to write a Debian package or anything like that. And Guix felt really approachable. The fact that everything was code, it was really easy for me to get in and start to package things or start to make variants of other packages. Once I started using the distro, it was nice to have whole system rollback where I didn't lose a day's work if I did a bad upgrade. I could just go back to the previous version of the system. And then there's easy development environments, which actually were not there when I started with Guix, but would be eventually. And another theme of this talk is that I really want to encourage this notion of extending versus embedding. The Nix project has this Nix language, and then embedded into it, into the package recipes, are snippets of Bash and things like that. There's this kind of mix of languages, and the Nix language is kind of like icing on the top of it, and it's really a lot of C++ and Bash underneath. Whereas Guix did a very interesting thing by using Guile all the way down, almost. Of course, there still is that C++ build daemon, which, fingers crossed we replace with Guile in time, thanks to the people working on that project. So Scheme isn't just icing on top of like a C++ and Bash cake. Scheme is the cake. And I think that's a really, really important thing. And I think that's what has led to Guix having like the success that it's had. So in 2013, I became a Guix contributor. My first ever patch was packaging libtheora. There were lots and lots of low-hanging fruit at that time. Lots of things weren't packaged. I moved on to packaging SDL, SDL2, and related libraries because I like to do game stuff. So those were all missing. I added those. And eventually, Ludovic gave me commit access, which I still have commit access. So I guess he made the right call there. I guess I was somewhat trustworthy. So that was very neat. I had never been given commit access to like a project that wasn't my own before. So that I wasn't paid to do. It was the first FOSS project that gave me commit access. So thanks, Ludovic. Later on, I became a Guile contributor. Again, low-hanging fruit or just simple things. I wrote a procedure that converts an association list to a hash table. And then later on, with a former maintainer, Mark Weaver's help, we wrote, as a team, we wrote this system REPL co-op server module. And it's a way, before Guile had things like suspendable ports and fibers and things, it was a way to integrate a REPL server into a program that's running an event loop, like say maybe a GTK program, or in my case, a video game that's using SDL2 to manage the event loop with inputs and graphics and things like that. So that was my first step into Guile stuff. And then moving on, I went beyond just packaging things for Guix. I wrote a build system, and I wrote a build system for Ruby. I was familiar with Ruby from my corporate job at the time, and I wrote Guix build system Ruby and some initial Ruby packages, like different versions of Ruby and different Ruby gems, and Piotr, which I'm sure many of you know, well known here in the Guix community. He was involved in this effort too and helped me out. So that was great. Moving on, I also, I mentioned I liked Guix for making easy development environments, but at the time, couldn't do that. I knew about Nick's shell, and I was jealous that they had that cool tool and we didn't. So I wrote something called Guix environment, which you all now know as Guix shell. There's an interesting story behind that, and it's just that we called it Guix environment because we didn't want to just, it felt copying to call it Guix shell, although Guix shell is admittedly the better name. I'm glad it switched to that. And at the time, the reason why Guix shell exists is because there's some not so great defaults in Guix environment. Does anyone remember the ad hoc flag? That exists because at the time we just did not achieve consensus on like sane defaults. So Guix environment, if you said Guix environment Python, it doesn't put Python in your shell. It puts the dependencies of Python in your shell. You had to use the ad hoc flag to get Python itself. And I wanted the default behavior to be what ad hoc did. But it was not really agreed upon at the time, so thus the ad hoc flag exists. And then eventually, everyone came to understand that the ad hoc thing is silly, and that should really be the default behavior, and thus Guix shell. So that's the story there. I wrote the initial Guix environment, and I'm glad it's been improved by others moving forward. A year later, I introduced Guix publish. The motivation for this is that we wanted to encourage more substitute providers. But at the time, the Guix project was using the Hydra CI system, which is borrowed from Nix. We didn't have Quiris yet. And so running Hydra is like a big, I think it was a C++ program. It was big. It was hard to run. It was a lot, required a database and stuff. And if you just wanted to just publish some substitutes over the network, it would be a lot easier to just have something you could run on the command line with your Guix tool. So that was Guix publish. It uses all the Guix scheme APIs. It's built on top of Guile's web modules for running the web server and everything. It does route handling, like URI route handling through Guile's pattern matcher, ICE9 match. It's a neat thing. It seems to have been useful over the years, but I think we can all agree that substitute availability is far from a solved problem. And probably in the future, this has been talked about at various points, but distributed substitutes seem like the way to be going. And I have some thoughts there for later. Moving beyond that, in 2015, I wrote a little thing called Call with Container. At the time, I was, containers were becoming like a really big buzzword in the software industry. And, Docker was synonymous with container. And I was growing really frustrated that the idea of a container was more about the disk image that Docker produced, like this layered disk image that is built from a Docker file, and not so much about the runtime environment that's actually providing the isolation. So that's what the good stuff is. The good stuff is actually the runtime environment, the Linux namespaces, C groups, other things that provide some isolation. Of course, with problems, security issues are found in Linux namespaces all the time, but it's something. And I was wondering, can we just implement the good parts of Docker for Guix? Because we have this system that's reproducible, that we can understand the whole package graph. Like we have a lot of things that Docker does not have. And so I wrote Call with Container. And so the idea was to, not to mount opaque disk images of unknown provenance, which probably have unpatched security vulnerabilities, but instead to bind mount GNU store directories, which is just like what the Guix build daemon is doing under the hood too, when it sets up build environments. And so this achieves containment plus reproducibility. And Call with Container gets used in Guix shell with the -- container flag, Guix system container, and also if you use containerized shepherd services. What I don't think we ever got, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, is like a Docker daemon kind of thing that like can orchestrate and like manage containers. But the underlying tech is there, and I did the initial implementation. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about like some non-Guix stuff, but it's all relevant to Guix because Guix enables me to do my work in an efficient way. I wrote a static site generator in Guile because I noticed there weren't any. And I think think there's supposed to be one static site generator per programmer, and I hadn't written one yet, so decided to write one. And of course, I use Guix.shell for that. At the time, it was Guix environment, but now Guix.shell. Guix is the first distro that gets any package update. So anytime I make a Haunt release, Guix gets updated immediately. It's probably also the only distro that gets those updates. I don't know if the usage of it is widespread enough to be in Debian or something, but in any case, Guile people use Guix, and those are the ones that tend to want to use Haunt, so it's there. And what was really interesting is that eventually both the Guix and Guile websites adopted Haunt to manage, like to describe and publish their website. So that was really cool. I didn't expect that. I just wanted something, quick for myself, and so that was really neat to see. And I still get emails about Haunt with regularity. So it's very cool. It's probably my most popular thing I've written. 2016, I bought a house. Don't need to spend much time on it. But who could have imagined this would use up all my free time? I kind of mostly stopped contributing to Guix in the way I had. I have not returned to my previous level of activity prior to that. But on the flip side, the Guix community has grown a lot, as evidenced by meetups like this. And I have the luxury of just mostly being a user now. I don't do a whole lot in the Guix codebase anymore. But I do some package updates and things. So moving on, in 2017, I decided to make a video game library called Chickity. So I got into Guile to make games, and then I got distracted by this Guix thing, and I still wanted to make games. So there was not really any good game programming libraries for Guile yet, so I wrote my own. Along the way, I created Guile SDL2 to provide SDL2 bindings to get window creation and input events. And of course, I use Guix.shell for managing that development environment. And the thing about Chickity is that it's not just a wrapper around another game library that's written in C or C++. Like, it's not just a wrapper around Raylib that's doing everything else. It's not like a thin wrapper around something else. It's very much inspired by Guix to maximize the usage of Guile. So, for example, all of the rendering code until we hit the graphics driver, until we hit libgl, is written in Scheme, which not many other Scheme or Lisp game libraries can say. I think really one of the only other ones is the trial game engine for Common Lisp, which does a lot more than what Chickity does. But most others are thin wrappers around other things written in C or C++. And being able to do so much in Scheme is made possible by Andy Wingo's just incredible levels of compiler and VM work. But it was really Guix that motivated me to really push for using Guile as much as we can. So moving ahead a couple years and back to Guix, for years I'd wanted an answer to Chef or Ansible, but for Guix, like how to manage remote systems or multiple remote systems with Guix. It was great as a local tool for managing your packages, for running a distro on your laptop. But I wanted more. I wanted to manage cloud servers and things like that. So along with Christine Lemmer-Weber, we participated as co-mentors in Google Summer of Code. And we mentored Jacob, who was able to actually make this a reality, implemented Guix deploy, being able to deploy updates over SSH. And it was a Google Summer of Code project that actually made it upstream. We tried really hard to make sure that we could actually land what we had said we would work on, and we did. And I now manage my personal server with Guix deploy, and also we use it at Spritely now. I think there's lots of improvements that could still be made. There's lots to do, but there's all sorts of other ways it could be improved. Sometimes like the SSH stuff is flaky and it fails and it's frustrating. So, please, if looking for volunteers to improve that. So yeah, pandemic happened. I'm not gonna focus on that, but we're jumping right to 2022. In 2022, I became the co-host of a little thing called the Lisp Game Jam, which happens on itch.io. It's a independent games publishing platform. And I'm co-host along with the Fennel maintainer. Fennel is another Lisp. It's not a scheme, but it's a Lisp all of its own that compiles to Lua. So it's a great choice for games. And the maintainer of that is Technomancy. And so we co-host that jam. And I swear it's relevant to I swear it's relevant to Guix and the other things I do. And we'll see that shortly. So in late 2022, I got hired by Spritely. And Spritely is a US 501c3 nonprofit. And it was co-founded by Christine Lemmer-Weber, who I've mentioned several times at this point. We had become good friends. And at this point, in several years prior, become world famous for the ActivityPub standard that powers Mastodon and other Fediverse applications. And so the purpose of Spritely is to build the next generation of secure distributed networking infrastructure. And we use object capability security to do that. And now this is not a talk about that. We could spend a lot of time on it, but Spritely.institute is the website. I will continue to talk a little bit about what we do and how it relates to Guix. But there's a lot of really good stuff to look at there. We build stuff with Guile, and we use Guix to do it. But we're also working on things like networking protocols and open standards, so that other languages and other runtimes can participate in this. It's the research we do is relevant to all programming languages. And so we have this thing called the Object Capability Network, and we're working on that alongside colleagues in other groups and businesses such as Agoric. You may have heard of them. And yeah, so it's an open standard for capability secure networking. It's currently in the pre-standardization phase. If you're curious of what the next generation of secure distributed applications might look like, check out okapen.org and maybe get involved. And see other Spritely talks for a lot more information about this stuff. So my role at Spritely is that I was initially hired as the core infrastructure architect to work on some things like a distributed debugger for understanding the happenings in a distributed program and trying to find problems when they arise. But since then, I've become the CTO, which is strange to me to have such a title, but it's an honor, and I have a great time working at Spritely, and I have I couldn't ask for a better team that I work with, and many of them. Juliana Sims is a recent new member to the team that is currently working on adding goblins to Shepherd to make it distributed and do all sorts of neat things, new things that Shepherd couldn't do before. I also work with Jessica Talon, who was also involved in ActivityPub and is really the one leading a lot of the engineering effort on writing a lot of the code for the Goblins distributed programming system and pushing forward the Okapen pre-standardization process. So I've got the best team. So my first big project was this thing internally we called Questy. It's a distributed debugger, and in this screenshot here, what you're seeing is like a mock-up of it's real. This is a real output from our debugger that had a kind of mini dungeon crawler style game that was taking place between multiple machines, and we were able to, get the causality graph of the events that are happening in the game in order to put together a time series diagram like this to understand what's going on in the program and to debug problems. So again, check the Spritely blog if that sounds like something interesting to you. These are the kind of fun problems we work on there. But back to what we're really here for. How does Spritely use Guix? I've said it over and over again, and I'll say it one more time. Guix shell is the best, and we use it for all of our development environments. If you clone a Spritely repo, there's a Guix.scm or a manifest.scm in that repo, and you can, if you're a Guix user, you just run Guix shell and you get everything, and you can start using or hacking on our stuff that way. We use Guix deploy to manage our servers over SSH. Very, very handy. We use Guix pack to build CI images for GitLab. which is a topic I've seen come up with some regularity lately on the mailing list and other places. And also, Goblins and Hoot releases are immediately published to Guix on release day. I haven't explained what Hoot is yet, but I'll get there. But just know that when we release a new update to some of our tech, it goes to Guix immediately. So we couldn't be bigger fans and users of Guix at Spritely. So as a quick highlight, because I've noticed people talking about this a lot lately, it's pretty easy to use Guix to make GitLab CI images. You can use Guix pack with the -f Docker flag. And something like this would use the ZSTD compression and whatnot. And then once you have your Docker image, you don't actually need to use Docker, which is frustrating to use because you need to be in the Docker group, and you might need to run the Docker daemon to do stuff. Instead, you could use this little tool called Scopio to copy that image up to a container registry. So this is just like of course, an incomplete snippet of what one of our scripts is, but it's super handy, and we use this in the Hoot project mainly to update our CI images, which include like really big software like that take a long time to compile, like V8, something that we would not want to wait for every time we have a CI job. We bake it into an image and we upload it. And Guix pack is great for making the image, and Scopio is great for just doing the work to upload the image, and don't have to worry about Docker. Remove Docker from the entire loop. It's great. So at Spritely, we started this really, really great project called Hoot. And the purpose of Hoot is to run Guile on WebAssembly and to get scheme programs into the browser. David Wilson of System Crafters said that this is the future of scheme hacking, and I am inclined to agree with that. Hoot is a scheme to WebAssembly compiler, and it has its own WebAssembly toolchain, which means it does not use mscripten, which is built, which is for at the LLVM toolchain. It's how most other projects that target WebAssembly get there. And most often used for static programming languages. This is the path that your Rust and C++ and things use to get to WebAssembly binaries. So we have our own dedicated toolchain, and now, at long last, we have Scheme in the browser. The dream of the 90s is alive with Hoot. JavaScript was originally supposed to be some kind of scheme in the browser, and well, we're finishing that job thanks to WebAssembly. Andy Wingo is the lead engineer, who name you probably know. He's the Guile maintainer and compiler wizard, not only for Guile, but for V8 and SpiderMonkey and the other things that he works on over at Igalia. And my involvement has been that I wrote the WASM interpreter in Guile. So we have this WASM VM module, which is kind of funny because it means that you can compile Guile to WebAssembly and then run Guile on Guile in the WASM interpreter. It sounds very circular and silly, but it's actually an excellent thing to have because it allows us to internally run tests without having to have a heavy WASM engine involved, like V8 or something. Though we still test against V8 as like a correctness oracle and as like our production target. But in Guix, if you look at the Guile Hoot package, you would notice that there is no dependency on Node or V8 or WASM time, any kind of WASM engine like that. It doesn't need it in order to run its test suite, which is very, very cool. It's really the only dependency on Hoot is Guile. It's great. So I'm still actively working on Hoot. I work on the toolchain and the scheme implementation. So I'm working on like across like the whole thing. So in late 2023, we decided to test out Hoot by making a little game called Strigoform. I didn't make this like officially as a Spritely thing, but it certainly is popular within Spritely. It's a space shooter. I'm sure the frame rate is really chugging here, only because I'm screen sharing and this is going over the network. So we made another game. It's called Circobon. I saw that Christine is going to link the game in the chat. It's built with the latest release version of Hoot, and notably a work-in-progress port of our distributed programming system, Goblins. So it's built on top of Goblins. It uses Goblins actors and the transactional rollback feature of Goblins, which, hey, an awful lot like Guix in that respect. It's built on top of that to implement the gameplay. So it's us getting very close to having not only Hoot working well enough to run real programs, but also to have distributed, object capability secure programs running in the web browser. All right, that's enough about, that brings us up to the present, and that's enough about the past. I want to talk about the future to wrap things up. Just a few things that I think would be really great to see that I might be sort of involved in, but like I'm not a key player in, or don't have time to develop. Things that I really want to see and encourage. This is a working title, Guix Develop. The idea is that it's Docker Compose, but for Guix. You run Guix, you'd clone a repo, run Guix Develop, and it would like make your Guix shell, but it would also spawn like a shepherd with under your user account that would run, different kind of servers that you need. A web application might need a database running, or like Redis or something, job queue, these kinds of things. For developing Hoot programs, we always have like a development web server running. So it'd be nice to not have to take up like a terminal window just to run that server. It'd be great if we just had a shepherd, that ran that service. But it does introduce a funny problem, which is like another kind of service. We already have like system services and home services, and those don't mix. And then if we introduce like developer services, we couldn't use the Postgres service from, the system services for a developer. You'd have to write your own service that ran PostgreSQL. I'll get to this more in a minute, but that's kind of like an unfortunate thing of Guix right now, is when we find other uses for services, they often don't mix, and that's just kind of due to the ambient authority nature of Linux and the system we're building on. But I've wanted like a Guix Develop, Docker Compose solution for a long time, and I just haven't gotten around to it. If you'd like to build it, please run with that idea. I'd love to see it, and I'd love to be a user of it. And then this is the future, but it's also kind of the present. Distributed Shepherd, and that's a project that's actually currently funded by NLNet, and it's in development by Julie Sims, one of the engineers here at Spritely. And it's the idea of combining Shepherd plus Spritely Goblins to make an even better Shepherd. The architecture of Shepherd right now is currently such that it is built on an actor-like model, and introducing Goblins is kind of taking that idea all the way and making it so that multiple Shepherd instances can talk to each other, maybe and potentially across networks. So for me, I would really like to be able to like orchestrate a cluster of Guix machines securely this way. That would be really cool. As another next step, maybe we extend Guix deploy to use Shepherd plus Goblins to deploy over the Object Capabilities Network instead of SSH. A lot of cloud providers these days, you don't often deploy things to the machines over SSH. You run some kind of agent daemon on them and then communicate that way. And it's kind of gross in one way, because it's like you install something from your cloud provider on there that does, who knows what. But it's also convenient because talking over the SSH protocol is not always the best thing when you don't have for non-interactive use cases. So having Guix deploy run over OCAPN would be really cool. Is that viable? I don't know. I would love to see someone explore this. Also, distributed substitutes. This comes up from time to time. People talk about substitutes over GNU-net, IPFS, perhaps Eris. This is an area I don't know a ton about distributed storage, admittedly, but there's people in our community and at Spritely and elsewhere that are interested in this sort of thing. So it would be great to see it explored further. So I just want to give my thumbs up to that. and I'd like to see that. That could resolve some of our substitute availability problems that crop up from time to time. And then going even further, I had this notion, and this is actually something from Christine Lemmer-Weber, said Guix as the OCAP operating system. And the really interesting thing about this is that by using object capability security, we could actually do interesting things like unify the service architecture in Guix. There would no longer be a split between system services and home services, where system services assume their root and then can drop privileges to a different user, like the Nginx service. The Nginx service drops privileges to the Nginx user and runs the daemon that way. And home services just, they run as you. They know that they don't have, root privileges, etc. If all services were written in such that they received their capabilities as arguments, files they can write to, programs they can call, these kinds of things, there would be no such split. And you could use the same service definitions in many contexts. And so we could reduce the impact of ambient authority in Linux with this like OCAP layer on top. And maybe this is something that we could use call with container as a component of. Julie Sims calls this the plan 9ification of Guix, which is, I think, a cute way of putting it. And finally, this is not exactly Guix related, but like this talk is partly personal to me. And I really want to be able to deploy Guile software that was written for like a native platform, like to run on the Guile VM, to also run on the web. And for me, as the maintainer of Chickity, it would be really nice to have Chickity running on Hoot, so that we can provide native and web builds of games written in Guile from the same source code. There is some standards work to be done to make this happen. The WASM GC proposal, while it's really great and it's enabling us to do a lot of awesome things, it's not, I wouldn't consider it like done. It's not fully baked in all regards. There are things that the Rust and the C++ of the world, those tool chains can do things with WASM linear memory that we can't yet do efficiently with WASM GC. Real-time graphics is one of those things, real-time sound. I'd like to see some of those issues addressed so that we can do real-time applications with Scheme, and Chickity just being one potential application. But we could also see things like Guix web UIs and things like that that are built with Hoot that have the same advantage that the rest of Guix has, where it's Scheme all the way down and you get code sharing. The modules used for the host side on Guix can also be used in the build daemon. Well, some of those modules could also be used on the web. We compile them to Hoot. So I'd really like to see more of that blend happening as things improve with Hoot and the WASM specification. And so I'm done. Again, I should add a bullet point. Sorry for the copious amount of technical difficulties, but I just want to say that opportunities come from unexpected vectors. I didn't realize that when I just like on a whim attended LibrePlanet 2012 that it would have like some monumental impact on me that like seems to have affected everything thereafter in an extremely positive way. I just want to give people encouragement if you're earlier in your journey, if you're looking for a way to contribute to free software, that I think the Guile and the Guix community are very friendly and generally speaking, and there's a lot to do. And I'm realizing that I put a typo in opportunities, so ignore that. But I want to encourage people to get involved. If you're not already involved with Guile and Guix, there's so much to do. And while Guile and Guix have gotten way more popular, and especially thanks to Guix being the driving force behind all of that, there's lots to do, and so there's lots of places to incorporate new people. So, and if you're a long-time member of this community, find people that need that helping hand to like make their first contribution, and just give them the boost that they need to make a first contribution and to keep going. And please keep pushing the limits of what Guile can do. Guix is doing that a lot. We're doing it at Spritely with things like Hoot. Guile is not icing; it's cake. It's it's a memory safe language that can do lots of things. And thanks to Andy's work on the compiler, it's quite efficient. We should keep pushing on this and seeing what the true limit is of what we can do. I think we can go a lot further. And thank you to Steve and to the other Guix.social organizers. Thank you for inviting me. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I'll pause now for questions. Thank you.
What do you think the sort of first application will be for Hoot? What's the sort of is there a particular area of application or type of way in which Hoot will likely be most mature in early on?
Yeah, I think the thing that immediately comes to mind are cases where you might reach for a JavaScript library like React or Vue or something, where you're building an interactive web application, not just like a web page, where you want to do interesting kinds of like DOM manipulation and having lots of interactivity and things happening on the client, not like lots of just loading web, like every click loads a new web page. I could see things for maybe a tool like Queris. There might be some use case there where having replacing some of the JavaScript stuff with Scheme would be helpful. Those are things we can do now. We can wrap the various web APIs like the document object model, and we demonstrate this on our blog right now. If you scroll the Spritely blog, you'll see some examples of this. That seems to be the most obvious place right now. I got a question from AVP, and I'll just read it. From my understanding of microkernel operating systems, there's a problem that when you move most of the building block out of the kernel, it introduces bottlenecks. Is it possible that OCAP and OS will have the same bottlenecks? Well, I'm not at all an expert on microkernel things. However, I guess what I'm referring to, at least as like an initial project, would be to not truly run on a microkernel, but to use Linux and build on top of it, and build in as many build a security layer as best we can, build object capabilities as best we can on top of an ambient authority system, just for practical reasons, right? Like Linux is deployed everywhere, tons of drivers, all of these things. We should run with that and add the security that we can that's feasible. So I really can't speak to the microkernel stuff, though. It's just not my area of expertise. I hope that helps somewhat.
Connected to that, David, maybe you could, for those not in the know, could give a kind of 101 level on what OCAP is.
Yes.
And I've heard both you and Christine talk about the actor model. And I actually don't know what the actor model is. So if that's connected, I'd love to hear what that is as well.
Sure. And I will say in advance that Christine will do a better job answering such a question, but I'm the one with the mic right now, and I'll do my best. So I'll start with object capabilities. The motto we have with object capabilities is that if you don't have it, you can't use it, which is in contrast to, say, your user group security model, where you do things as you, and things are allowed or denied based on who you are, your identity. There's like access control lists that determine the things you're allowed to do and things that you're not allowed to do. Whereas in an OCAP world, in an object capability world, if I wanted to, say, open a file to write with, I would have had to been handed a reference to such a file. You can think of it like a key. Like I've been handed a key. This allows me to do something. It's not because I'm me that I get to do something. It's because I have a handle to something that grants me such a privilege. And that's the key distinction that makes OCAP so powerful. And for all of us who are scheme programmers or just programmers in general, we just think about when we write programs, we call functions and we pass them inputs, and then we have outputs. You can think of the inputs like capabilities. Imagine if you couldn't do anything besides use those things that you got as inputs. That's what OCAPs are all about. And so, Guix uses this model to some degree. We can draw a distinction there. The functional package model is that when you're building your package, you only have access to the inputs that you were given. and you don't have network access, things like that. So it's similar in that regard. It's you know, just because you ran solitaire as your user doesn't mean that it can read your .ssh directory. You know, there you would only give it the capabilities to do the things that it really needs to do. So that's OCAPS in a nutshell. And now the actor model is an interesting way of doing asynchronous programming. And I'm going to do, let me see. So the scheme programming language was actually came about as an exercise of trying to understand what the creator of the actor model, Carl Hewitt, what he was actually, they were trying to understand what is this actor model thing. And they, Jerry Sussman and Guy L. Steele and others set to solve this problem. And we got Scheme as a result. And they were exploring this idea. And an actor is really, at the simplest level, what I can say is that an actor, you can think of it as a function that receives a message and can do something with that message and return a response. And it can also change its behavior in response to an input. So, for example, you know, you could the simplest actor we ever talk about is like a greeter actor. You send a message with the name of the person to greet, and it returns to you some response saying I'm greeting you. And the interesting thing there is that it's all just about message sending, and there's not necessarily anything synchronous about this. And if you've ever used JavaScript promises and you then check out goblins, you'll see the word promise turn up as well. And that's the idea of you send a message and you get a promise of the response, and you can use it to continue with your conversation, and then eventually the system like converges on what's happening. And at Goblins, well, at Spritely, we actually use something called the VAT model of computation. It's not purely the actor model, but that's going to get probably too far for this conversation. But I don't think I did the best job explaining there, but I hope it's somewhat helpful.
That was great. Thank you.
Yes, and Christine, I knew Christine would be very helpful in filling in the details I missed in the chat. And so, yeah, another like buzz phrase I can leave you with is Lambda, the ultimate security model. And there's lots we can talk about there, and you should really check out the Spritely Institute website if this intrigues you. Okay, I'm gonna go back.
He's trying to get you to, you know, do some PR and you know, do some early announcements, exclusive on the Guix.social.
What do you think is the most exciting in the near term from Spritely? Oh, that's interesting. In the near term, I think it's going to be a demonstration of distributed applications built with goblins running in the web browser. I think I can't say, you know, I don't want to, no promises until we have the thing. You know, it's not going to ship until it ships. But the team is doing a really great job, like making this happen. And Julie Sims is doing, in particular, is doing a fantastic job bringing goblins to Hoot and to the web. And so I'm excited to show off some kind of networked application that runs in web browsers that's really easy for people to check out. So that's what I'm really excited about. But also, I'm excited about the persistence work that we're doing, that particularly Jessica Talon and Christine are involved in. And if we get that on the web too, we'll also have things like, you know, applications that, you know, remember what you've done in them and save to, say, like browser local storage or things like that, and have all sorts of nice features. So I think we're starting to get out of the point where we're just like, we tell people about our tech and it's cool, we want to engage you. We're getting to the point where we can really show you something and you can actually use it and put your hands on it. And like, that's going to be very exciting. So really looking forward to that. I'm seeing some thanks, great inspiring talks from Marku. Thank you. Ephraim says, call containers one of my favorite bits of Guix when I'm trying to hack on something in Guix. Thank you. It's been improved a lot by other people, but I was happy to get the ball rolling on that. AVP says using Guix Shell for most of my projects. Yay, double thumbs up. Let's see, let me explain my question a little bit. If you blur root user boundaries, does it require some kind of context switch? Are you talking about a mental context switch or like an actual in the computer context switch? Because I think it requires definitely a context switch in how you think about things, because we're all used to certain things being taken for granted, like being able to like write to a temp file, or to do, like if you're root, you're used to just doing whatever. If you're a user, you're used to having domain over your home directory. But things are going to get kind of a lot more like I would say a lot more like a web browser, where you kind of have to consent to certain things, like give access to a microphone, or to upload a file. You have to grant the browser permission to read certain files. An arbitrary website can't just ask the browser to look at the contents of your home directory, those kinds of things. So I think there's going to be a context switch in terms of how programmers think about things, and then also how we design applications. But in some sense, like phone operating systems and web browsers have already gotten people used to a number of UI patterns that I think we would continue to use in an OCAP world. So hopefully people, there's already some level of acclimation to this. I don't know if that's exactly the answer to the kind of answer you wanted, but that's how I interpreted it. Let's see. Okay, thanks, Julie, for some, yes, linking to the Spritely Core white paper. That's great. Manish says, really enjoyed my blog post on the recent Lisp Game Jam and the ice cake patterns. Thank you. You're welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Okay, sounds like I answered Pradiki's question. Reading the Spritely blog has been described as a long nerd snipe. Yes, I think so. Okay, I got to the bottom of the chat. I don't know if there's any other questions.